The alien warrior noticed my touch when I thought I was only fixing her armor. The drop pod hit atmosphere like a meteor, and Jake Martinez knew they were already in trouble. The shields were failing, red lights screaming across every surface, and through the viewport he could see the alien fleet tearing apart the human defensive line. 3 months ago, he'd been a civilian mechanic in Detroit. Now he was strapped into a military transport heading straight into hell. The pod slammed into the surface of Kepler 442b with enough force to crack his visor. Jake's harness released automatically, dumping him onto the deck as alarms shrieked. Through the smoke, he saw the other 5 members of his repair team already moving, grabbing equipment, checking weapons they barely knew how to use. Move, 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 Sergeant Lisa Grant was shouting, her voice cutting through the chaos. We've got wounded incoming from the front line. Command says we've got maybe 20 minutes before the Vaxar push through our position. Jake grabbed his toolkit, the weight familiar even in the chaos. Outside, the sky was burning. Plasma fire streaked overhead in colors that shouldn't exist, and the ground shook with impacts that felt like earthquakes. He'd signed up for this because Earth needed every hand it could get, but nobody had told him it would be this immediate, this real. The field hospital was a joke, just reinforced tarps stretched between broken equipment. Already the casualties were coming in. Human soldiers with wounds that made Jake's stomach turn, but also others. Aliens fighting alongside humanity. The Vaxar Empire had enemies, and those enemies had become Earth's desperate allies. That's when he saw her. She was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with 4 arms and skin that seemed to shift between blue and purple. Her armor was advanced way beyond anything human, but it was damaged badly, leaking some kind of fluid that hissed when it hit the ground. She was conscious, her 3 eyes tracking everything, and she was trying to remove the chest plate herself with her lower set of arms while her upper arms held some kind of rifle. That one, Lisa pointed. Martinez, get that armor off her before it explodes or whatever the hell it's about to do. Jake ran over, his hands already moving to his tools. Up close, she was even more intimidating. He could see the muscle beneath the armor, the way her breathing was labored, controlled. She looked down at him, and he saw something he didn't expect in those alien eyes. Pain, yes, but also calculation. Assessment. I need to remove this, Jake said, not even sure if she understood English. The power cell is compromised. She didn't respond, but she lowered her rifle slightly. Permission, maybe. Or just resignation. Jake's hands found the release mechanisms, human fingers working alien technology through pure mechanical intuition. The armor was hot, almost burning through his gloves, and as he worked he had to get close, had to brace himself against her to get the leverage needed. His shoulder pressed against her side, his hands running along the seams finding the locks. That's when he felt her go completely still, not rigid with pain. Still with attention. Her breathing changed, becoming slower, deeper. Jake glanced up and found all 3 of her eyes locked on him, intense in a way that made his heart skip. He touched the armor, just the armor, but something in her posture had shifted, something fundamental. The chest plate came free with a hiss of depressurizing gas, and Jake quickly moved to the damaged power cell, his fingers working fast. Around them the battle was intensifying. Plasma bolts were hitting closer, close enough that he could feel the heat wash over him. I've got you, he muttered, not thinking, just talking the way he always did when working. Just hold still, almost there. Her hand, one of the upper ones, moved slowly and touched his shoulder, not grabbing, not stopping him. Just resting there, gentle despite the claws he could see. Jake looked up again. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read but somehow understood anyway. Recognition, maybe. Or surprise. He didn't have time to figure it out. The power cell came free, and he tossed it away just before it detonated, showering sparks harmlessly into the dirt. You're safe now, Jake said, already reaching for the backup systems in her armor. She spoke then, her voice deep and musical, words in a language he didn't know. But her hand was still on his shoulder, and somehow he knew this moment had just changed something neither of them understood yet. An explosion rocked the ground, and Jake's world turned to fire and noise. The blast threw Jake sideways into a pile of equipment crates. His ears rang, his vision blurred, but training took over. He rolled, checking himself for injuries, finding only bruises. The alien warrior was already on her feet, all 4 arms moving in coordinated precision as she brought her rifle up and fired 3 shots so fast they sounded like one continuous pulse. Through the smoke, Jake saw 3 Vaxar soldiers drop, their insectoid armor cracking under the plasma impacts. She moved like liquid death, her damaged armor sparking but her body flowing from one firing position to another. Jake had seen human soldiers fight, had watched training videos, but this was different. This was art and violence mixed into something that made his breath catch despite the terror. Martinez. We need to fall back. Lisa was dragging the wounded Marine, blood streaming from a gash across her forehead. The lines collapsed. We got 2 minutes before we're overrun. Jake grabbed his toolkit and ran to help, but the alien warrior was suddenly there, scooping up the wounded Marine with her lower arms while her upper arms kept firing. She barked something in her language, and even without translation, Jake understood. Follow me. They ran through hell. The camp was disintegrating around them, human and alien soldiers fighting desperate rearguard actions as they retreated. A Vaxor warrior, massive and armored like a tank, burst through a burning tent directly in their path. The alien warrior beside Jake roared, a sound that vibrated in his chest and charged. What happened next took maybe 5 seconds, but burned into Jake's memory like it had been hours. She dropped the wounded Marine carefully, almost gently, then became a whirlwind. Her upper arms fired while her lower arms drew blades from her thighs, curved and gleaming. She went low, under the Vaxor's plasma fire, and those blades found the weak points in the enemy's armor with surgical precision. The Vaxor went down, and she was already turning, firing again, covering their retreat. Jake realized his mouth was hanging open. "Move, civilian!" A human corporal grabbed Jake's arm, snapping him back to reality. They were retreating to a secondary position, a fortified bunker built into a hillside. The alien warrior was shepherding them, her body between the humans and the enemy, taking hits on her armor that would have killed any of them instantly. Inside the bunker, the chaos didn't stop, it just changed. Medics were working on the wounded, officers were shouting into communicators trying to coordinate what was left of their forces, and ammunition was being distributed with desperate speed. Jake found himself shoved into a corner with his toolkit, next to a flickering light panel that was clearly dying. The alien warrior entered last, backing through the door while firing. Once inside, she finally stopped, her body sagging slightly. Now that there was actual light, Jake could see the damage more clearly. Her armor was a mess, multiple systems failing, warning lights blinking, and patterns that probably meant something critical. And there was blood. Not human blood, hers, dark purple, almost black, seeping from a gap where her side armor had been torn away. "You're hurt," Jake said, moving automatically toward her. She looked down at him, and again he saw that strange stillness come over her. Lisa was barking orders nearby, organizing a defense, but the warrior's attention was entirely on Jake. She made a sound, a clicking purr that seemed to come from deep in her chest, and lowered herself to one knee, bringing her massive frame down to something closer to his height. Up close like this, Jake could see details he'd missed before. Her skin wasn't just blue and purple, it had patterns like living tattoos that shifted with her breathing. Her 3 eyes weren't all the same, the center one larger, more complex. And despite the alien features, despite everything that marked her as completely non-human, there was something in her expression that was almost vulnerable. "I need to patch that wound," Jake said, gesturing to her side. She reached out with one of her lower hands, and before Jake could react, she touched his face. Just for a moment, her palm against his cheek, her clawed fingers careful and deliberate. Then she spoke in her language, the words musical and complex, and gestured to her injury with her other lower hand while keeping the upper arms ready with weapons. Jake's hands were shaking as he opened his toolkit. This wasn't just armor repair anymore. This was field medicine on an alien species he knew nothing about. But she was trusting him, that much was clear. Her weapons were pointed away, her posture open despite the pain he could see in the tension of her muscles. He grabbed a spray sealant, standard issue for human wounds, but it was all he had. "This might hurt," he said, knowing she probably didn't understand the words, but hoping his tone conveyed the meaning. She clicked again, that purring sound, and one of her upper hands moved to rest on his shoulder, not stopping him. Supporting him, maybe, or supporting herself. Jake couldn't tell. The sealant hissed as it made contact with her wound, and he saw her entire body go rigid. But she didn't pull away, didn't strike out. She just breathed, deep and controlled, while Jake worked as fast as he could. The wound was deep, cutting through what might have been muscle or something else he couldn't tell. But the sealant was working, the purple blood flow slowing and stopping. "There," Jake said finally, sitting back. "That should hold until you can get real medical attention." She looked at the repair work, then back at him. And then she did something that made Jake's heart nearly stop. She took his hand, the one still holding the sealant canister, and brought it to her forehead, pressed his palm against her skin, right between her eyes, and held it there. Around them, the bunker was loud with activity, but in that moment, Everything else faded. Jake could feel warmth under his palm, could feel the slight texture of those living patterns in her skin. Her eyes closed, all three of them, and she made a sound like a sigh. "What are you doing?" Jake whispered. She opened her eyes and released his hand, then touched her own forehead with 2 fingers before touching his chest, right over his heart. A gesture. Clearly a gesture that meant something in her culture. "Okay." Lisa's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "We've got movement on the perimeter. Everyone who can hold a weapon, get to the firing line. Martinez, we need those defensive turrets online now." The alien warrior stood, fluid and fast despite her injuries. She looked down at Jake one more time, and there was something in her expression that seemed like regret. Then she was moving to the firing line, her rifle ready. Jake grabbed his toolkit and ran to the turret controls. His hands worked automatically, rerouting power, bypassing damaged circuits, but his mind was elsewhere, on the touch of alien skin against his palm, on the way she had looked at him like he was something precious and fragile, on the gesture she'd made, forehead to heart, that felt like a promise or a prayer. The turrets came online with a whir, their targeting systems lighting up. Through the firing slits, Jake could see the Vaxor forces regrouping, preparing for another assault. They had minutes at most. He looked across the bunker and found her already watching him, her weapons ready but her eyes on him. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever happened next, something fundamental had shifted between them. He'd thought he was just fixing armor, just doing his job, but she had noticed his touch in a way that went beyond mechanical repair. The first Vaxor plasma bolt hit the bunker's shields, and the real battle began. The Vaxor assault came like a tsunami of kitten and plasma fire. Jake had never seen so many of them in one place. Dozens, maybe hundreds, their insectoid bodies moving in that disturbing coordinated way that suggested hive mind communication. The bunker's turrets opened fire, Jake's hasty repairs holding as they chewed through the first wave, but it wasn't enough. "We're going to be overrun," someone was shouting, maybe the corporal, maybe Lisa. Jake couldn't tell anymore. The noise was overwhelming. Weapons fire and screams and the weird clicking sounds the Vixer made when they died. The alien warrior was at the primary firing position, all 4 arms working in perfect synchronization. 2 arms fired her rifle in controlled bursts, while the other 2 threw something small and metallic. Whatever they were, they exploded on impact with enough force to scatter entire groups of Vaxor soldiers. But they were still coming. Jake abandoned the turret controls and grabbed a rifle from a dead soldier. He barely knew how to use it, had maybe 20 hours of training total, but staying at the controls meant dying when the bunker fell. At least this way he could shoot back. He moved to a firing slit next to the warrior, brought the rifle up with shaking hands and squeezed the trigger. The recoil nearly knocked him back, his shot going wide and hitting nothing but dirt. He adjusted, fired again, and this time a Vaxar stumbled. Not dead, but wounded. The warrior made that clicking purr sound, glanced at him, and then one of her lower hands was on his, adjusting his grip on the rifle, changing his stance slightly. Then she was back to her own weapons, but Jake's next shot hit center mass, dropping the Vixer that had been charging their position. "Better," he muttered to himself, and kept firing. The battle became a blur. Time lost meaning. Jake fired until his rifle overheated, grabbed another, fired until that one was empty, reloaded with shaking hands, fired again. Beside him, the warrior was a constant presence, her voice calling out in her language, directing fire from the other alien soldiers in the bunker. Jake realized she wasn't just a warrior, she was commanding them. A Vixer breaching charge detonated against the bunker's door, and suddenly the enemy was inside. Close quarters, chaos. Jake swung his rifle like a club, caught a Vaxar across its mandibles, and then strong arms were around him, lifting him, moving him. The warrior had grabbed him with her lower arms and was carrying him while her upper arms fired point blank into the Vaxar that had breached. She set him down behind a supply crate, said something sharp in her language, and Jake understood. "Stay here." She dove back into the fight, her blades out now, moving through the Vaxor in the tight space with brutal efficiency. Other defenders rallied around her, human and alien fighting side by side, pushing back the breach. Jake didn't stay behind the crate. He couldn't. He saw a Vaxor aiming at the warrior's back, saw her distracted with 2 others in front of her, and moved without thinking. His rifle came up, his finger found the trigger, and he put 3 rounds into the Vaxor's head. It dropped. She spun, her weapons tracking to where the threat had been, and saw Jake standing there with his rifle still raised. Their eyes met across the blood-soaked floor, and something passed between them. Understanding. Partnership. She nodded once, sharp and deliberate, then turned back to the fight. They held. Barely. By the time the Vaxor assault broke and retreated, the bunker was a charnel house. Bodies everywhere, the air thick with smoke, and the smell of burnt metal and worse things. Jake was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, trying to remember how to breathe normally. The warrior approached him slowly. Her armor was worse now, barely functional, hanging in pieces. Her weapons were empty or destroyed, where she was limping. But she came to him and lowered herself to the ground beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "We're alive," Jake said, not sure if he was telling her or himself. She made a sound, softer than the purr from before, almost sad. Then one of her hands, the upper right, reached out and took his. Not grabbing, just holding, her clawed fingers gentle around his human hand. She was looking at their joined hands like they were something miraculous. Jake's heart was pounding, and not from the battle anymore. "What does this mean to you?" he asked. The touching, the gestures. What am I doing wrong or right? She looked up at him and he saw exhaustion in her eyes. Pain, but also something else, something warm. She spoke in her language, the words flowing like music, and even though he didn't understand, the tone told him everything. This wasn't just alien to her. This mattered. Martinez. Lisa dropped down beside them, her face gray with exhaustion. "Command is sending evac birds. We're pulling back to the main line. 20 minutes. The warrior's hand tightened on Jake's for just a moment, then released. She stood, offering him a hand up with one of her lower arms. When Jake took it, she pulled him to his feet easily, and then held on just a fraction longer than necessary. "Your armor's destroyed," Jake said, looking at the damage. "You need repairs before you can fight again." She touched his face again, that same gentle gesture from before, and then touched her own forehead. The same gesture, forehead to heart. Jake was starting to think it meant something like trust, or bond, or maybe something even deeper that human languages didn't have a word for. The evac birds came in hot, dodging plasma fire from Vaxxer positions. The loading was chaos, wounded first, then the walking injured, then the able-bodied defenders. Jake found himself being pushed toward one of the transports, but when he turned to look back, the warrior wasn't following. "Wait!" Jake pushed against the flow of people. "Where's she going?" Lisa grabbed his arm. "The alien auxiliaries are going to a different rally point. Different chain of command. Come on, we need to move." "No." Jake pulled free. He didn't know why, couldn't have explained it if someone had asked, but the idea of being separated from the warrior now felt wrong on a fundamental level. He ran back, pushing through the crowds, until he found her. She was standing with a group of other aliens, different species, all warriors. They were preparing to move out on foot, heading deeper into the combat zone. When she saw Jake approaching, her entire body shifted, turning toward him like a flower to the sun. "I'm staying with you," Jake said. She cocked her head, clearly not understanding the words, but when Jake pointed to himself, then to her, then to the ground at her feet, her eyes widened, all three of them. She said something sharp to the other aliens, who looked at Jake with what might have been surprise or disapproval, he couldn't tell. Then she reached out and pulled Jake close, into what could only be described as an embrace. Her forearms surrounded him, careful of her claws, her body warm and solid. She held him for just a moment, then released him and immediately began stripping off a piece of her damaged armor. She offered it to him, and when Jake took it confused, she pantomimed putting it on. Protection. She was giving him protection. "This is insane," Jake muttered, but he was already figuring out how to wear the alien armor piece. It was designed for a completely different body shape, but he made it work, securing it across his chest and back. It was heavy, but it felt solid. Safe. She made that purring sound again, reached out and adjusted the armor slightly, and her touch lingered. Jake realized her hands were trembling very slightly. Was she afraid for him? Or was it something else? "Move out," one of the other aliens called in heavily accented English. The group started moving, and Jake moved with them, staying close to the warrior. She kept one lower hand on his shoulder as they walked, guiding him, and Jake realized this was how she was making sure he stayed close in the group of much taller aliens. They moved through the broken landscape, past the ruins of the forward base, heading towards sounds of fighting in the distance. Jake should have been terrified. He was a civilian mechanic playing soldier, wearing alien armor he barely understood, following a warrior he couldn't even talk to into a war zone. But when she looked back at him, checking on him with those three bright eyes, all he felt was certainty. This was where he needed to be. The night fell fast on Kepler, 442b, and with it came a cold that cut through even the alien armor Jake wore. The warriors group, 12 aliens of 5 different species and 1 human mechanic who had no business being there had found cover in the ruins of what might have been a Vaxxer supply depot before human artillery had turned it into twisted metal and scorched earth. Jake sat with his back against a fallen support beam, his hands working automatically on the warrior's armor. She'd finally consented to let him do more than emergency repairs, and Jake had discovered that alien technology wasn't as alien as he'd thought. Different, yes. Advanced, absolutely. But the principles were similar enough that his mechanic's instincts could guide him. Energy needed to flow from here to there. Structural integrity required support in predictable patterns. Heat needed dissipation. She sat perfectly still while he worked, but Jake could feel her attention on him. Always on him. Every time his hands found a new section to repair, every time he leaned close to examine a damaged circuit, he felt her breathing change, felt her body respond to his proximity in ways he was starting to recognize. This coupling is completely fried, Jake muttered, more to himself than to her. But if I can bypass it through the secondary system... His fingers worked, connecting circuits that probably weren't meant to be connected, but the power flow stabilized. There. That should hold. Vekshara. Her voice was soft, that musical quality even more pronounced in the quiet. When Jake looked up, she was staring at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. She touched her chest with 2 fingers, right over where her heart probably was, if she had a heart. Vekshara? Is that your name? Jake asked. She tilted her head, those living patterns in her skin shifting colors, then nodded slowly. She reached out and touched Jake's chest, questioning. Jake? He said. My name is Jake. Jake? She tried the sound, her mouth not quite shaped for human phonemes, but close enough. Then she smiled, and Jake realized it was the first time he'd seen her smile. It was different from a human smile, her mouth wider, showing teeth that were sharp and numerous. But there was no mistaking the expression for anything but happiness. Zake. Yeah, Jake said, smiling back. That's me. Vexhera made that purring sound deeper this time and reached out to touch Jake's face, but this time she didn't just touch and pull away. Her palm cupped his cheek, her thumb, or what might be a thumb, brushing gently just below his eye. Jake's heart was hammering, but he didn't pull away. Vekshara, one of the other aliens called out, a species that looked like they were made of living stone. They spoke in what Jake was starting to recognize as a trade language, words harsh and clipped. Vekshara responded without looking away from Jake, her tone suggesting she was telling them to give her a moment. Why do you keep touching me? Jake asked quietly. Not that I mind, I just want to understand. She studied his face, like she was trying to read meaning from his expression. Then she did something that shocked Jake to his core. She brought his hand, the one that had been repairing her armor, to her face. Not just her face. She pressed his palm against the side of her neck, right where he could feel the pulse of blood or whatever she had flowing through her veins. Her skin was warm, warmer than human, and under his palm he could feel her heartbeat. No hearts. Multiple rhythms, staggered and complex. Then she guided his hand down, slowly, deliberately, across her shoulder, down her arm, and to her hand. She laced her fingers through his, her hand so much larger that his disappeared inside her grip, and she held him there, their joined hands between them, while she watched his face with desperate intensity. Touch, Jake said suddenly, understanding flooding through him. It's not just touch. It's connection. It means something in your culture. Something big. Vexhera made a sound that might have been confirmation. She brought their joined hands to her forehead, held them there, then to Jake's forehead. That gesture again, but this time Jake understood it better. Sharing. Bonding. This was how her people connected. And I've been touching you since we met, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Fixing your armor. Treating your wounds. I've had my hands on you for hours, and to you that means... She nodded, and there was something in her eyes that looked almost like hope, like fear, like she was standing on the edge of something and waiting to see if Jake would push her over or pull her back. Jake should have pulled away. Should have explained that humans didn't work like that he'd just been doing his job. But looking at her, at the way she was holding his hand like it was precious, at the vulnerability in her alien features, he couldn't do it. Okay, Jake said. I don't fully understand this, but okay. The relief that washed over her face was unmistakable, and she pulled Jake closer, into another of those careful embraces, all 4 arms surrounding him but not restraining him. And Jake, despite everything, let himself relax into it. She was warm, solid, and somehow, despite her alien nature, Despite the battle and the death and the chaos, she felt safe. The moment was broken by a sharp whistle. One of the other aliens was signaling. Movement. Enemy movement. Vex'shara released Jake immediately, all business again. She checked her weapons, the repairs Jake had made holding, systems coming online with quiet efficiency. The other warriors were doing the same, preparing for contact. But before they moved out, Vex'shara turned back to Jake and pressed something into his hand. It was a small crystal, no bigger than Jake's thumb, glowing with soft purple light. She closed his fingers around it and touched their joined hands to her forehead one more time. Then she was moving, taking point position, and Jake had no choice but to follow. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, the alien warriors comfortable in the low light, their various sensory organs picking up things Jake's human eyes missed. He stayed close to Vex'shara, trusting her completely now, and she guided him with small touches, a hand on his shoulder, a gentle push to redirect him around obstacles. The Vexer patrol they encountered was small, maybe 6 soldiers. The alien warriors hit them like a surgical strike, silent and fast. Jake didn't even have time to raise his rifle before it was over. The Vax are dead or dying without ever knowing what hit them. But the one that got away, running into the darkness, that was the problem. "We're compromised," the stone-like alien said in English, probably for Jake's benefit. "They'll call reinforcements." Vex'shara spoke rapidly in the trade language, gesturing to the terrain around them. Jake didn't understand the words, but he understood the plan. They were going to set an ambush. Use the Vaxor response to thin their numbers. "This is crazy," Jake said, but he was already looking for good firing positions, already thinking like a soldier instead of a mechanic. Vex'shara appeared beside him, so close their shoulders touched. She handed him something, a small device with alien markings. She mimed throwing it, then showed an explosion with her hands. A grenade, maybe, or their equivalent. Jake took it carefully, studying the mechanism until he thought he understood how to arm it. "Thanks," he said, and she touched his face again, quick and gentle, before moving to her own position. The Vaxar came in force, more than Jake expected, maybe 30 of them. The ambush was devastating. The alien warriors struck from 3 sides, weapons fire and explosives turning the valley into a killing field. Jake threw his grenade, watched it arc through the air and detonate exactly where he'd aimed, scattering a group of Vaxor soldiers. Then he was firing his rifle, controlled bursts like Vex'shara had shown him, making every shot count. But the Vaxor weren't stupid. They adapted quickly, found cover, started returning fire with discipline. A plasma bolt hit so close to Jake that he felt the heat wash over him, smelled his hair singing. He rolled to new cover, kept firing, and saw Vex'shara doing the same, her movements fluid and precise. One of the other aliens went down, hit in the leg, and suddenly the Vexer were pushing forward, trying to exploit the weakness. Vex'shara was moving before Jake could think, charging the Vexer line with her blades out, her rifle forgotten. She was trying to pull attention, to give the wounded alien time to be extracted. She was going to be overwhelmed. Jake stood up and ran forward, firing as he went, his shots wild but enough to make the Vaxer hesitate. He didn't know what he was doing, didn't have any training for this, but he knew he wasn't going to watch Vexar die. He reached her just as a Vaxar warrior, massive and armored, crashed into her. They went down together, rolling, and Jake saw her blade arm pinned. The Vaxer was raising its weapon for a killing blow. Jake's rifle was empty. He threw it at the Vaxer's head, distracting it for just a second, and then he was diving at it, tackling it with his whole body weight. It was like hitting a wall, but Jake got his arms around its neck, pulling back with everything he had. The Vaxor thrashed, trying to dislodge him. Jake felt claws raking across his back, felt pain explode through his side, but he held on. Vex'shara's blade arm was free now, and she didn't waste the opening. Her blade found the gap in the Vaxar's armor, slid through, and the creature went still. Jake fell back, gasping, and Vex'shara was on him immediately. Her hands were on his face, his chest, checking for injuries. When she found the wounds on his back, she made a sound Jake had never heard from her before. Pain, rage, fear, all mixed together. "I'm okay," Jake gasped. "I'm okay." She didn't believe him. She scooped him up with her lower arms, her upper arms providing covering fire, and ran. The other aliens were falling back, the ambush successful but costly. They retreated into the broken terrain, the Vaxar not pursuing, and finally stopped in a cave system where they could regroup. Vex'shara set Jake down carefully and immediately began stripping off his armor to check his wounds. The claws had torn through his jacket and shirt, leaving deep gashes across his back and side. She made that pain sound again, then grabbed her medical kit and started treating him with shaking hands. "You're scared," Jake said, realizing it. "You're scared for me." She looked up at him, and in those 3 eyes Jake saw everything. This wasn't just cultural connection anymore. This wasn't just about touch meaning something in her society. This was personal. This was her being terrified that the human she'd bonded with, the one who touched her with such care and gentleness, had nearly died saving her life. "It's okay," Jake said, reaching up to touch her face the way she'd touched his. "I'm okay. You're okay. We're both okay." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, and Jake felt her entire body shudder. Then she was pulling him close again, so gentle despite her strength, holding him while she worked on his wounds, and Jake realized something that should have terrified him but somehow didn't. He was falling for an alien warrior he'd met less than a day ago, and she'd been falling for him since the first moment his hands had touched her armor with kindness instead of violence. The cave system became their shelter for 3 days while the wounded healed and the tactical situation outside stabilized. Jake had expected those days to be tense, dangerous, filled with constant alertness for enemy patrols, and they were all of those things. But they were also something else entirely, something Jake hadn't anticipated. They were intimate, not in any physical sense beyond what had already passed between them, but in a deeper way. Vakshara stayed close to Jake constantly. When she stood watch at the cave entrance, she positioned herself so she could still see him. When she ate, she sat beside him, sharing rations that Jake's human digestive system probably wasn't meant to handle, but he tried anyway to make her happy. When she slept, she did it in shifts like all the warriors, but always within arm's reach of where Jake was resting. And the touching never stopped. She would reach out seemingly at random just to brush his shoulder, to check his bandages, to adjust his armor, to simply rest a hand against his back while they sat together. Each touch was brief, careful, but Jake was starting to understand that for her, these touches were communication. They were sentences in a language he was only beginning to learn. On the second day, Jake finally got a chance to actually repair her armor properly. Not just field patches, but real work. He'd found his toolkit miraculously intact, and the cave had enough flat space for him to lay out her armor pieces and examine them thoroughly. "This is beautiful work," Jake said, studying the way the armor was constructed. "Human engineering is sophisticated, but this is elegant. Every connection serves 2 purposes. Every plate is both protection and power conduit." He looked up at Vakshara, who was watching him work with that intense attention he'd come to expect. "Your people are artists." She tilted her head, clearly not understanding the words, but she moved closer, kneeling beside him. She took one of the armor pieces and began demonstrating how certain parts moved, how they were meant to flex and flow with combat movement. It became a teaching moment, her showing Jake the proper way the armor should function, him figuring out how to restore that function with limited tools. Their hands kept touching as they worked, passing pieces back and forth, and Jake noticed that Vakshara's skin patterns were shifting more actively, the colors brighter. He'd noticed it before but hadn't understood. Now he wondered if it was emotional, if her biology was giving away her internal state. "Are you happy right now?" Jake asked, more thinking out loud than expecting an answer. Vakshara looked at him, then at their hands working together on the armor, then back at his face. She made the purring sound deeper than ever before and nodded. Then she did something that made Jake's heart skip. She took his hand and pressed it flat against her chest, right over where those multiple heartbeats pulsed. Under his palm, Jake could feel her hearts racing, all of them beating fast and strong. "Oh," Jake said quietly, understanding. "Yeah, me too." She smiled, that wide alien smile that should have been frightening but somehow wasn't, and leaned forward until their foreheads touched. That gesture, the connection, she held them there, perfectly still, just breathing together, and Jake felt something settle in his chest, something that felt like rightness. One of the other warriors, a species that looked almost reptilian, spoke up from across the cave. Jake didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. "Disapproving." Vakshara responded sharply, her voice taking on an edge Jake had only heard when she was commanding in battle. An argument ensued, rapid fire in the trade language, and Jake didn't need translation to understand what it was about. Him, his presence, his connection to Vakshara. The reptilian warrior gestured at Jake, then at Vakshara, then made a cutting motion with their hand. Separation. They wanted Jake separated from Vakshara, maybe sent back to human lines. Maybe just kept at a distance. Vakshara stood, and even though she was wounded, even though her armor was still only partially functional, she was suddenly every inch a commander. She spoke, low and dangerous, and the reptilian warrior actually stepped back. The stone being, who seemed to be second in command, said something that might have been conciliatory. Vakshara responded, then turned and reached down to pull Jake to his feet. She kept her hand on his shoulder, possessive and protective, while she continued speaking. And even without understanding the words, Jake got the message she was sending. He wasn't going anywhere. He was staying with her. And anyone who had a problem with that could take it up with her personally. The cave fell silent. The other warriors exchanged glances. Then, one by one, they made gestures that Jake interpreted as acceptance, or maybe resignation. The stone being even approached and said something directly to Jake in heavily accented English. She claims you. This is understood. No more dispute. Claims me? Jake asked. But the stone being had already turned away, and Vekshara was guiding Jake back to their corner of the cave, her hand never leaving his shoulder. Once they were seated again, she pulled Jake against her side, one arm around him, and went back to watching the cave entrance while he worked on her armor. Claimed, Jake muttered. Is that what this is? He should have been bothered by the implication. Should have objected to being claimed like property. But when he looked at how Vekshara held him, careful and gentle despite her strength, when he felt the way her hearts were still racing under her armor, he couldn't find it in himself to protest. On the third day, word came through the alien communication network that human and allied forces had stabilized the line. A counteroffensive was being organized. The small warrior group would be extracted and folded back into the main force. It should have been good news. Jake felt sick. Extraction meant returning to human command. It meant separation from Vekshara. They'd go to different units, different chains of command, and in the chaos of war, the chances of seeing each other again were minimal at best. Vekshara seemed to understand, even without being told. As they packed up their minimal gear, preparing to move to the extraction point, she kept touching Jake, more frequently now, more desperately. Her hands on his face, his shoulders, his arms, like she was trying to memorize him through touch. The extraction was a military transport, human-made, with separate sections for human personnel and allied aliens. The moment they boarded, a human officer tried to direct Jake to the human section while the aliens moved to their designated area. Vekshara's reaction was immediate and volcanic. She moved between Jake and the officer, all four arms spread wide, her body language unmistakably aggressive. The officer backed up, hand going to his sidearm, and suddenly every weapon in the transport was being raised, humans pointing at aliens, aliens pointing at humans. "Stand down!" Another voice, sharp with command authority. A human woman in commander's insignia pushed through. What the hell is happening here? Sir, this civilian needs to move to the human section, but this alien is preventing. I'm staying with her, Jake interrupted. I'm not leaving her? The commander looked at Jake, then at Vekshara, and something in her expression shifted. Understanding, maybe. Or just exhaustion with the infinite complications of war. You know what you're asking for? Yes, sir. You realize that staying with the alien auxiliary puts you under their command structure? You'll be reassigned. Your records will show you embedded with foreign forces. Some people are going to have serious questions. I understand, sir. The commander studied him for a long moment, then looked at Vekshara, who was still standing protectively over Jake, her weapons ready but not quite aimed. She feels strongly about this. Yes, sir. Fine. Martinez Jake, civilian auxiliary reassigned to alien auxiliary forces under Commander Vekshara's unit. Let the bureaucrats sort it out later. She looked at the other soldiers. Lower your weapons. We're all on the same side, remember? The tension broke slowly, weapons being lowered with visible reluctance. Vekshara seemed to understand that she'd won this confrontation and immediately pulled Jake to the alien section of the transport. Once they were seated, she wrapped two of her arms around him and held him close while the transport lifted off. Jake felt her breathing, fast and relieved, and realized his own hands were shaking. He'd just officially defected from human command to stay with an alien he'd known for 3 days. It was insane. It was reckless. It was probably going to complicate his life in ways he couldn't even imagine. But when Vekshara nuzzled against his hair, making that soft purring sound, Jake knew he wouldn't have made any other choice. The main base was overwhelming after days in the field. Thousands of soldiers, humans, and dozens of alien species all coordinating in a massive military installation that had been built in just weeks. The noise alone was staggering, and Jake found himself staying close to Vekshara as they moved through the organized chaos. They were directed to a debriefing area, separated into species groups. When they tried to separate Jake from Vekshara again, she simply picked him up with her lower arms and carried him into the alien debriefing area. No one tried to stop her this time. The debriefing was conducted in the trade language, which Jake obviously didn't understand. But he sat beside Vekshara, her hand on his shoulder, and watched as she reported to what was clearly a higher-ranking officer of her species. This one was even larger than Vekshara, with more elaborate patterns in her skin and 6 arms instead of 4. The senior officer's eyes kept drifting to Jake, and she said something that made Vekshara's grip on Jake's shoulder tighten. An argument followed, voices raised, and Jake wished desperately that he understood what was being said. It ended with the senior officer making a dismissive gesture and waving them away. Outside the debriefing area, Vekshara was visibly agitated, her skin patterns shifting rapidly through colors Jake hadn't seen before. She paced, all 4 arms moving in gestures that seemed like frustration or anger. The stone being from their unit approached and spoke to her in low tones, and whatever was said didn't help. "Vekshara?" Jake said, touching her arm. "What's wrong?" She looked at him, and there was something close to panic in her eyes. She took his hands in hers, holding tight, and spoke rapid words he couldn't understand. Then she pressed their joined hands to her forehead, then to his, that gesture of connection they'd established, and Jake understood. They were going to separate them, orders from above. "Different assignments." "No," Jake said firmly. "We'll figure this out. There has to be a way." Vekshara cut him off by pulling him into the tightest embrace yet, all 4 arms surrounding him completely. She held him like he was going to disappear, like she could keep him safe and close through sheer physical will. And Jake held her back as best he could with his 2 human arms, his face pressed against her shoulder, breathing in her scent that was alien but somehow familiar now. "I won't leave you," Jake whispered. "I don't care what orders they give." "I won't leave you." She made a sound that might have been a sob, if aliens could sob. Her whole body was shaking, and Jake realized she was crying, or the alien equivalent. He pulled back enough to look at her face and saw moisture on her skin, her 3 eyes glistening. "Hey," Jake said, reaching up to wipe at the tears. "Hey, it's okay. We'll figure this out. I promise." She touched his face with both upper hands, so gentle despite the claws, and looked at him with such desperate longing that Jake's heart broke. Then she leaned down and pressed her forehead to his, and they stayed like that, just breathing together, while the base moved around them and the war continued and the universe tried to pull them apart. But Jake Martinez, civilian mechanic from Detroit, had made his choice. He'd felt her touch, had understood what it meant to her, had seen the warrior behind the alien features, and found something precious there, something worth fighting for, something worth keeping, and he wasn't letting go.